So you might be asking yourself, when do I need to be CMMC compliant? And at the time of this recording, at the end of January 2023, there's all kinds of headlines and blogs flying around saying that CMMC is delayed. But when it comes to understanding CMMC and when it comes to making predictions about CMMC, all roads lead to rulemaking. And unfortunately, rulemaking is both complicated and obscure, and that puts companies in a very difficult situation, because how do you know what you're hearing in the news is actually true? And how do you formulate a strategy for tackling your contractual cybersecurity and compliance obligations as a result? So the purpose of this presentation is to provide you with all the necessary context around the rulemaking process as it relates to CMMC specifically, to help you make better strategic decisions. In order to do that, there's several things that we have to cover. First, we have to understand the sequence of DoD rulemaking that has led to the CMMC program, because the way that the CMMC program and its rulemaking will play out are directly affected by the way that rulemaking has played out in the lead up to it. Then we need to plot the two possible rulemaking scenarios that could occur for CMMC on a single timeline in order to compare what the ballpark of scenarios happens to be. Then we have to understand the impact of variables like the requirements in NIST Special Publication 800-171, which the CMMC program assesses. And then we also need to look at how long it takes the average DoD contractor to implement those requirements, which tends to be a much more accurate way of formulating a strategy than whatever happens to be going on in CMMC rulemaking at the time. And then finally, we can take a closer look in order to uncover the basis for all of these headlines and rumors of delay, or even the likelihood of delay in terms of how rulemaking will play out, so that you can decide for yourself if you feel like that analysis is sufficient. So first, we need to understand the sequence of rules that have led up to CMMC. So the concept to keep in mind is that a rule is just another word for an agency regulation, and rulemaking is the process of creating and codifying those regulations, literally turning those regulations into something like a law that we would pass via Congress. And so the most important concept to remember as it relates to CMMC is that CMMC is a DoD assessment program that evaluates the government-wide requirements in NIST SP 800-171. So the way that we got there is that in 2013, the DoD issued what I call the original rule, and that was a rule that created the contract clause 252-204-7012 for the first time. And that contract clause at that time prescribed requirements in a document known as NIST Special Publication 853. Most people at the time had no idea that this happened. They did not know that they had these obligations, and so they didn't implement these requirements. Several years go by, many bad cybersecurity things happen, and DoD decides to issue another rule, which I refer to as the requirements rule. And this was a rule that revised the DFARS 7012 clause and added things like FedRAMP moderate equivalency for dealing with government data in the cloud, or having certain access to DoD, or giving certain access to DoD at contractor facilities in the event of a cybersecurity incident. But most importantly, and most famously these days, it updated the requirements that it prescribed. And it said that it now prescribes the requirements in NIST SP 800-171 rather than the requirements in 853. This was a reduction in the number of requirements, the overall level of requirements from the original clause in 2013. But like the rule in 2013, most companies had no idea that this happened. They didn't know that they had these obligations, and so they didn't implement their requirements. Several years go by, many more bad things happen in the world of cybersecurity, and so DoD decided that they needed to come and assess the implementation of those requirements from the 2016 rule via what I call the assessment rule. So in 2020, they issue a rule that created two assessment programs. This one rule had two parts, or two prongs in the language of the rule. One of those prongs was the DoD assessment methodology, otherwise known as DODAM, which was prescribed to contractors via the DFARS clauses 7019 and 7020. The other side is known as CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, which is prescribed to contractors via DFARS Clause 7021. Both of those programs, all of those clauses, relate to the assessment of the requirements in NIST SP 800-171, which are prescribed via a contract clause resulting from a different rule. These are separate and distinct rules that occurred at different times. So even though the 2021 rule is directly related to the requirements in the 2016 rule, because those programs assess those requirements, the requirements were actually created several years prior. So most people were unaware that any of these were occurring before the 2020 rule came out. And once the 2020 rule came out and people suddenly became aware of these requirements and the cost and the burden and the impact of the requirements in NIST SP 800-171, there was quite a bit of public backlash and political heat coming towards the DoD over what was going on with cybersecurity requirements via DFARS clauses. So DoD decided to essentially circle the wagons and spend all of 2021 reviewing the CMMC program. And at this time, nobody really knew what was going to happen with the CMMC program because the DoD didn't make any public statements about what they were planning to do with the program. Would they change it fundamentally? Would they change it not at all? Would they scrap the program altogether? Nobody really knew. At the end of 2021, DoD released what we now call CMMC 2.0, which was a series of modifications to the CMMC prong of the 2020 rule. These were things like moving from 5 maturity levels to 3 maturity levels, or allowing limited waivers, or limited plans of action and milestones, or allowing level 1 certifications to happen with self-assessments rather than external assessments. Lots of these changes that you've probably heard about under the umbrella of CMMC 2.0 were the output of the 2021 review in response to the backlash from the 2020 rule. The other thing that the DoD program review in 2021 decided to do was to codify those modifications. And this was the signal that DoD was prioritizing CMMC and taking it extremely seriously, because there is a heavy bureaucratic cost to agencies that go through rulemaking. It takes a significant amount of time, it takes a significant amount of effort, and it is really just a lot of work that nobody wants to do. So for DoD to have taken over 9 months, pretty much, almost the entire year of 2021, and then issued modifications to CMMC, and then decided to also codify those changes via rulemaking, was a signal that CMMC wasn't going anywhere. In fact, it was a signal that CMMC was inevitable, which we hadn't had up until that point through 2021. So once we end up with this new rulemaking effort, which we can call the CMMC program rule, we have to remember that it only affects one part of the rule from 2020. It only affects the CMMC prong of the 2020 rule. So there's no real reason to hold up the DODAM side, the DoD assessment methodology side of the 2020 rule, and keep it in limbo while we wait for rulemaking to sort itself out. So as a result, DoD decided to split the 2020 rule into 2 separate and distinct rules, which we now have what we would refer to as the CMMC clause rule and the DODAM rule. So even though it came from a single rule in 2020, they are now separate individual rules on their own timelines. So remember, one of the most important concepts to keep in mind is that all of these rules, now that we have 3, doesn't really matter the overall number, they all relate to the assessment of requirements that are the output of a rule that has been done since 2016. So keep that in mind as we move forward here. So a couple of concepts to keep in mind. The DODAM side of the rule, which is now its own rule, the DoD assessment methodology approach to the requirements in NIST SP 800-171, is done. It is the output of rulemaking in 2020 that is finished. It is codified. It is on the books. It is in black and white. It is in the wild. Pick your idiom. It is out there and ready to mess up the day for many, many companies that don't understand that it is a live assessment mechanism that the DoD can use at any time to show up and assess contractors in their implementation of NIST SP 800-171. However, because it is a separate and distinct rule, it's not relevant to the CMMC timeline, so we don't need to worry about it for this presentation. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are two separate CMMC rules, the clause rule and the program rule, because they are being written or codified into separate parts of what is known as the Code of Federal Regulations, where all of the regulations go when they are codified. And Title 32 is where national defense programs live, like CMMC, and Title 48 of the CFR is where the acquisition regulations live, which is where contract clauses live. So you can think of them as the CMMC program rule, otherwise known as 32 CFR CMMC, and you can think of the CMMC clause rule as 48 CFR CMMC. It just relates to where in the Code of Federal Regulations they are being written to as a result of rulemaking. Now, something to consider and something that people often overlook is what exactly does it mean for CMMC as a program to be codified at 32 CFR in Title 32 with other national defense programs? So just to sort of give you a frame of reference for the level at which DoD is taking CMMC seriously, these are DoD-wide, Pentagon-wide, Department of Defense spanning regulations that are extremely fundamental and broad and far-reaching. Things as fundamental as uniform regulations, and things as heavy-duty as base realignment and closure, or the FOIA program, things related to access to classified information, or the family advocacy program. Basically every major DoD regulation and program that spans the Pentagon is where are written to 32 CFR, and soon that is where CMMC will be written. So for people who think that CMMC is maybe not being taken seriously by the department, when you look at the family of regulations and where they live and what's written to that location in the Code of Federal Regulations, CMMC is on par with things like the GI Bill and things like the Freedom of Information Act. So this is something that DoD doesn't necessarily draw a line to very often, but just for context, it's very important to keep in mind. So a key concept also to keep in mind is that the CMMC clause from the 2020 assessment rule is pending the completion of the rule for the CMMC program. So we are not waiting on the requirements in 800-171. Those are already done. So everything related to the CMMC clause is waiting on the timeline for the CMMC program rule. Okay, so there are a couple ways that CMMC program rule can play out. And so we need to plot that on a timeline in order to get a better understanding of what that looks like moving forward. So, like we said, the CMMC program rule needs to be effective before the CMMC clause can show up in contracts. And in order for that to happen, there's three things that need to occur. First, the DoD has to submit the CMMC program rule to the Office of Management and Budget for regulatory review by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Lots and lots of acronyms. So we've got the explanation here of what those acronyms are. Basically, the DoD, as a normal part of rulemaking, needs to submit their rule for regulatory review. Once that rule is through regulatory review, the CMMC rule will be published in the Federal Register, the daily journal of the government in terms of its regulatory activities. Once that rule is published in the Federal Register, it will receive one of two statuses. It will either be published as a proposed rule or it will be published as an interim final rule. And this is where the timelines start to split. So the easiest way to understand the difference between a proposed rule and an interim final rule is essentially this. It is based on when DoD needs to respond to public comments. So in the first scenario, when you have a proposed rule, the CMMC program rule would be effective after DoD adjudicates and responds to public comments via publishing what is known as a final rule in the Federal Register. Now, the other alternative is an interim final rule, which means that the CMMC program rule would become effective before the DoD has to respond to public comments. Effectively, it would be immediately upon publication, the rule would become effective because they don't have to wait and respond to public comments. Now, something to keep in mind, proposed rules are the normal way that rulemaking works. This is the standard approach to what is known as notice and comment rulemaking. You make a notice of a proposed rule, the public gets to comment, you adjudicate those comments, you publish your responses via a final rule, and then the regulation becomes effective. Interim final rules, or IFRs, are exceptions to that process that accelerate the normal rulemaking approach, and they are extremely difficult to get. They are very rare, and they are an anomaly within the rulemaking process because public input and part of the democratic process is very important. So it's very, very rare that you would get an interim final rule. However, it's important to sort of map out both of those scenarios. So in November of 2021, when they announced CMMC 2.0, they said that the rulemaking process to codify those modifications would take 9 to 24 months. Now, based off of the most recent DoD statements that we have at the end of January of 2023, they plan to submit their rule for regulatory review, which is step one, sometime in February of 2023. And we went back and we looked at all 328 times that the DoD has submitted a rule for regulatory review since 2009. And based off of looking at those entries by OMB, we discovered that it takes on average 66 business days to go from step one to step two, rule submission to OMB to publication in the Federal Register. Now, both scenarios will have a 60-day public comment period, which is a standard part of rulemaking. In the interim final rule scenario, after that 60-day public comment period, the rule is essentially effective immediately. Based off of some other details that we'll skip over of the rulemaking process, that means that if we get an interim final rule, the rule would be effective in the summer of 2023. However, there's always a possibility that you might get a proposed rule, and that would say that after the 60-day public comment period, the DoD has to take all those public comments, sort through them, and respond to them in a published final rule. And going back and looking at every time the DoD has published a proposed rule that subsequently was published as a final rule in response to public comments, it has taken the DoD since 2009 an average of 333 business days to get through that process. Now, I want to stress and emphasize that these are averages. These are averages. These are not absolute numbers. They are not even the bottom of the range. These are just averages. So something to keep in mind is that OMB, not the Department of Defense, determines whether a rule will qualify for interim status under what is known as the good cause exemption of the Administrative Procedure Act, the rules that govern the rulemaking process, if you will. Something else to keep in mind is that this is sort of a formula because DoD often says we're planning to submit the rule and then for whatever reason, the submission date will move. So essentially you can sort of use these three rules of thumb. The big thing to look for is when the DoD will submit the rule to OMB for publication and review. So take whatever the submission date is and based off of their averages, add around 2 months for the rule to be published. So if they submit it in February, add about 2 months till we get some published rule. If it's an interim rule, then you would take that publication date and add about 2 months for the rule to become effective and essentially start rolling out according to the DoD and getting inserted into contracts. However, if we have a proposed rule scenario, take that publication date and then add about a year, 333 business days on average, essentially add about a year. Now, like I said, these are just averages, right? These are not absolute numbers. When you break down the distribution of the amount of time that it's taken DoD to go through submission and then publication, the first two steps, you'll see here on this histogram that 113 of those times it took between 15 and 45 business days. So although the average is 66, the distribution of those times is actually to the left of that average. Similarly, the amount of time that it takes a rule to go from proposed to final, the average is to the left, right? The distribution is to the left of the average, which means that about 66 of the times that a rule was proposed and then went to final took between 90 and 350 business days. And this is inclusive of all outliers, of all the very few cases where the process took quite a long time. We did not trim or exclude any outliers to make the numbers look better or worse. These are all of the situations that DoD has gone through, either submitting a rule for regulatory review or having a specifically proposed rule go through to final. So just to stress, these are averages. Don't take them as baselines or absolutes. If anything, they are maybe on the high side. The actual distribution shows that it doesn't take quite as long as the averages would indicate. Okay, so why would we get an interim final rule or a proposed rule? Like which one are we going to get? OMB gets to decide, and as it turns out, there's a case for both. The probability or the likelihood of which one happens all depends on your perspective. So one of the reasons why you might get an interim final rule is that the current status quo doesn't provide the government with adequate assurance over the protection of their data in the supply chain. Recently, there have been findings from DoD's assessment team known as DIBCAC and other private sector analyses of implementation rates in the DoD supply chain for 800-171, and all of those analyses have shown that the implementation rates have basically remained unchanged since 2016 and hover around 30%. And so therefore, if you look at the interim final rule case, it is not sufficient to only use DFAR 7012 and 7019 and 7020. You have to have an external assessment mechanism in order to try to force a change to those implementation rates. Similarly, a reason why you could say that they will get an interim final rule is that the CMMC program rule simply reinforces previous rules that themselves had interim final rule status. This is why I was saying it's important to understand the timeline of rules that led up to where we are now, because we had the original rule in 2013 that was then revised by the requirements rule in 2016, an interim final rule, that was then assessed by the 2020 assessment rule, which itself was an interim final rule. And now all we're doing is trying to modify one part of the rule from 2020. So to start over from a proposed rule status doesn't really make a lot of sense. If the national security basis for that good cause exemption was valid in 2016 and valid in 2020, there's no reason to assume that it wouldn't still be valid in 2023, since the status quo of security in the industrial base hasn't improved really at all. Another reason why we could say that there could be an interim final rule is that this interim final rule is not devoid of using public comments as inputs. Remember, the decision to do rulemaking and to make changes to CMMC known as CMMC 2.0 were based off of the 850 comments that were received on the rule in 2020. So it isn't like this is a rule that sort of came out of nowhere and wants an exception and will get no public input. It is actually heavily influenced by a significant number of public comments from the rule, which it simply modifies. Another reason why we could end up with an interim final rule is that the popular perception of rulemaking, even the normal rulemaking process of going proposed, analyzing comments, responding to comments, the popular perception that that would be a delay, which we already see in headlines, could harm the overall growth of the CMMC ecosystem, which would then harm the ability for the DoD to funnel people through assessments and then gain assurance over their data. So several reasons why you could make a case for getting an interim final rule. In contrast, you could also make a case for a proposed rule. Specifically, the complexity of the CMMC program rule could simply be too great for OMB to say that it qualifies to skip the public comment process. The CMMC program rule is rumored to be over 100 pages long, and that is a lot of rule for something that is only supposed to be describing a handful of modifications to the CMMC program. And so if the substance of the rule and the structure of the revised program deviates too greatly from what was put out at the end of 2021 or what was put out in the 2020 rule, then OMB could say, we didn't get enough public comment on these specific details. You have to go through the normal process. You could also make the case that the status quo does provide adequate assurance and that DoD can simply use the DFARS 7019 and 7020 and 7012 clauses in order to try to gain sufficient assurance over a limited number of highly critical programs. You could also say that additional public participation is always better and that agencies should never be able to release regulations that would have such a broad impact on the public without always making sure that they receive public comment, which is a perfectly valid argument when it comes to the rulemaking process. And the flip side of the decaying CMMC ecosystem argument is that it would allow more time for the ecosystem to grow. And by having more assessors and more assessment capacity, you would be able to have more companies go through assessments faster and for less money. So 2 cases for each scenario, essentially. And so which one will end up getting picked by OMB is still up in the air. DoD does not get to decide what that will be. And as you might imagine, reporting saying that one is more likely than the other definitely jumped the gun in terms of what we know today. Now, to complicate things, it isn't just a scenario of flipping a coin between the proposed rule or an interim final rule. There are a couple of things that DoD contractors need to be aware of that can affect this timeline. So if we go back to this picture of the various rules, remember the 2020 rule was split into separate rules. All of those rules that we currently have right now focus on the assessment of requirements in 800-171. Now, in the summer of 2022, Stacy Voss-Janik said something very, very important. She said that SP 800-171 requirements are not part of the CMMC rulemaking. It is not part of what will come out, whether it is interim, final, or proposed, because it was the output of the 2016 rule. It is already in black and white and codified on the books. And if you take a close look at the language of DFARS 7012 as revised in the 2016 rule, it says that DoD contractors have to implement the version of NIST SP 800-171 in effect at the time the solicitation is issued. And that is very important to remember because in the summer of 2022, NIST announced that they were planning to revise NIST SP 800-171 because the last revision came out several years ago. So in August of 2022, Ron Ross said that over the next 18 months, they were planning on revising all of the NIST documents that pertain to the requirements underlying the CMMC assessment program. Towards the end of 2022, they let us know that they were planning to issue the initial draft of 800-171 in late spring of 2023. So when we take those two things together, we can expect a publication window of the new revision to the 800-171 requirements sometime between late spring and the end of 2023, essentially. And when you think about whether we'll have an interim final or a proposed rule scenario, this becomes very important because if we end up with an interim final rule scenario, all of the early adopters who are ready to go for their assessment will likely be able to get an assessment against the current version of NIST SP 800-171 and therefore avoid any increases or changes or complexities in the new revision, which is what most people are predicting. However, a lot of companies are happy that they might get a proposed rule and a quote-unquote delay, a year extension unofficially, while DoD goes through public comments. But be careful what you wish for, because if we end up with a proposed rule, then it would essentially guarantee that everybody who has to go through CMMC once it is effective would be assessed against the new standard, which is likely to be larger, which would take more time to assess, it would take more time to implement, it would be more costly overall. And speaking of time to implement, probably the most important lens to view these timelines through is the average amount of time that it takes contractors to implement their requirements. Now, from a Summit 7 perspective, based off of our experience helping nearly 1,000 companies that contract with the DoD, the vast majority of whom would be considered small and medium businesses, roughly in the 50 to 100 employee size, it takes companies on average about 12 to 18 months to go from the status quo to what you could consider to be assessment ready with the requirements in NIST SP 800-171. So for enterprising organizations that want to be ready, when the rule is theoretically going to be published in May of 2023, then for a company to be ready for that day, they would have needed to start their implementation about the time CMMC 2.0 was announced in November of 2021. Now, if companies wanted to be ready at the interim final rule scenario, when CMMC would be rolling out into contracts at the end of the 60-day public comment period, then companies would have needed to start their implementation in earnest, basically the beginning of 2022, or about a year before the time of this recording. For companies that are saying, well, a proposed rule is a delay, and that is a delay of quite a long time, and a year is a long time, not necessarily, because when you overlay the average amount of time, if a company wanted to be ready when the final rule came out under the proposed rule scenario, which would roughly be summer of 2024, then those companies would need to start their implementation in earnest basically right now at the time of this recording in the first quarter of 2023 in order to hope to be ready for assessments when that rule goes into effect. Okay, so what's up with all of these headlines and blogs talking about delay and talking about likelihood? Basically, when you dive into the analysis and details of what's going on with rulemaking, everything is still within the window that DoD originally predicted of 9 to 24 months from November of 2021. So the thing to know about the rumors of delay and the likelihood of delay is where that news is coming from. And so the first place that can come from is what DoD has stated. And personally, based off of my close reading of everything that DoD has said over the years, I have not seen anywhere where DoD has said anything other than they want an interim final rule. So in early 2022, they said they wanted an interim final rule by May of 2023. In May of 2022, they said they still want an interim final rule sometime between March and May of 2023. They were actually hoping to go a little faster. And then just in January of 2023, they still said that they want an interim final rule, that interim final rule scenario that was in the timeline earlier. So it's clearly not based off of anything that DoD said last year or moving into early 2023 that would indicate that there's some form of delay. DoD hasn't even stated that they wanted a proposed rule, which if you interpret standard rulemaking as a delay, that isn't even what DoD has said. So the other place that the sort of news stories come from is something known as the Unified Agenda. And the Unified Agenda is essentially a twice-a-year publication that contains all of the planned rulemaking by agencies that gets submitted up to OMB. And at this time, in early 2023, all of these headlines and blogs are saying, oh, it's going to be delayed because the fall 2022 agenda that was published at the end of 2022 says we're going to have a notice of proposed rulemaking. A couple things to know. The estimated date of publication is still May of 2023, so that can't be where rumors of delay are coming from. The other thing to know about the Unified Agenda is that they are out of date by the time they're published because they actually reflect agency data calls from several months prior. So the Unified Agenda that was published at the end of 2022 is reflective of information submitted by DoD in September of 2022. So for everybody making decisions about headlines that are coming out in early 2023, realize that you are getting fed information that is several months old that also conflicts with what DoD has most recently stated about their desire to get an interim final rule. Ultimately, remember, DoD doesn't control whether it is proposed or interim final or not, so whatever they put into the Unified Agenda isn't reflective of what the rule will actually be, and certainly isn't reflective of any likelihood of what the rule will necessarily be. Further, it's also interesting to note that people view the most recent Unified Agenda saying that there might be a proposed rule as an indication of some form of delay. Because if you go back to the actual official announcement of CMMC 2.0 in the Federal Register, it was known as an ANPRM, or an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. Literally, at the end of 2021, when DoD said we're going to start rulemaking, they gave an advance notice that the rule would be a proposed rule within the 9 to 24 month time frame. So for them to have come out and said, we plan to issue a proposed rule in the unified agenda is perfectly in line with what they said at the end of 2021. So that isn't news, and that isn't any indication of delay either. The spring 2022 agenda was the time where they said they wanted an interim final rule, and they actually wanted to go faster. So depending on when you got your news or which agenda entry you read, if you had only heard that there was an interim final rule scenario at work, then maybe when you found out that a proposed rule scenario was a possibility, you would interpret that as a delay if your timeline was slightly too narrow. Again, these are published several months after they are actually submitted, so you should always take them with a grain of salt. Now, just to reinforce the fact that unified agendas are only pieces of data and not necessarily things that we should reach conclusions for all on their own, the fall 2021 agenda, so the one published a year ago from the fall 2022 agenda, said that the CMMC rulemaking effort was basically parked in purgatory, known as long-term actions, and that the rulemaking process wouldn't get underway for at least a year, not even get started for at least a year. So how is it possible that CMMC 2.0 was announced at the end of 2021, that rulemaking was underway and it would take 9 to 24 months, but then in January of 2022, the unified agenda said that we wouldn't get started on rulemaking for at least a year? And that is because the unified agenda from the fall of 2021 is reflective of information from September of 2021, just like the fall 2022 agenda is reflective of information from September of 2022. They were still in the middle of their program review in 2021, so the unified agenda was not reflective of reality. This is something that is very important to keep in mind, because if you didn't get your news from the unified agenda in January of 2022, then you should probably reconsider getting your news based off of a unified agenda in January of 2023. Now, one useful thing about looking at the unified agenda is that the estimate for rule publication has been very consistent, and the timeline for rule publication has gotten shorter and shorter. However, what the rule will be published as, an interim final rule or a proposed rule, is still up in the air, something that DoD does not necessarily control. Okay, so we went through quite a bit of information here in order to sort of explain how we got through the rulemaking that has already occurred and now influences the CMMC rulemaking that is occurring. We talked about the various scenarios that could play out if we get a proposed rule or an interim final rule, and how that gets complicated by things like NIST SB 800-171 revisions, or the amount of time that it takes DoD contractors to implement their requirements in order to get assessed under programs like CMMC. And then finally, we wrapped up by trying to explain where all these rumors about delay or likely delays are coming from. And as it turns out, a lot of that comes from relatively thin analysis of relatively unreliable sources of information. So just make sure you double check the sources of information that tell you that CMMC is delayed or accelerated or otherwise. So a couple of key takeaways to try to wrap up a very long and sort of sweeping video here. So CMMC is a assessment program that evaluates the requirements in 800-171. Those requirements are the output of a rule that has finished the rulemaking process now 6 or 7 years ago. So if you're waiting for information about the requirements in 800-171 with the CMMC program rule, then you are mistaken. Another thing to consider is that the CMMC program rule needs to be effective before the clause can show up in contracts. So the timeline that we're talking about when we talk about CMMC rulemaking is the CMMC program rule, or 32 CFR CMMC, as it's sometimes called, based off of where it is being codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. Also remember, there is a case for both possible rule scenarios, an interim final rule or a proposed rule. However, DoD has been very clear and very consistent ever since they started their CMMC 2.0 rulemaking that they want an interim final rule. So you can always rewind and go back and look at what would happen for companies that have not started their implementation if DoD gets the ruling that they want. Finally, the NIST SP 800-171 implementation for 50 to 100 person companies averages about 12 to 18 months. That means that if DoD gets the rulemaking scenario that they want, most companies are over a year behind when they often don't realize that they are quite that far behind. And then lastly, recent news about CMMC rulemaking delays are based on old, incomplete information based off the fall 2022 agenda, which is not reflective of what's going on in DoD's mind at the beginning of 2023. It is reflective of what was going on at the end of summer of 2022. So when you see articles, or headlines, or blogs that tell you that there is a delay and they're based off the unified agenda, just remember that that isn't always the best way of understanding what's going on. So we tend to put out a lot of information about CMMC, and it can be somewhat difficult sometimes to sort through all of it. If you have any questions about any of the information covered in this video or any of the blogs and links that are relevant in the video description below, feel free to reach out and let us know.